Shedeur Sanders is about to get his first real test as an NFL starting quarterback, and the Browns organization just made a move that tells you exactly how seriously they're taking this moment. But here's where things get complicated. Over the last few weeks, one throw, one single interception, has sparked more debate than probably any incomplete pass should ever generate. A former NFL quarterback broke it down frame by frame and found something that completely changes how you should think about what actually happened. At the same time, local Cleveland media is pushing back hard against what they see as excuse-making, which raises a fair question about whether we're actually evaluating these plays honestly or just settling for whatever narrative fits our existing preference. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and it matters more than you'd think because Shedeur's debut against Buffalo is about to answer questions that camp reps never could. This isn't just about whether one quarterback had a better week of practice. It's about whether we know how to separate real signal from noise when evaluating young players under high-stakes pressure. Let's dig into what's actually happening here, because the answer is more interesting than the headlines suggest. The entire offseason conversation around the Browns' quarterback room has been building toward one specific moment, and that moment is about to arrive. Shedeur Sanders is finally getting his first career start against the Buffalo Bills, and the way this organization has been preparing for it tells you everything you need to know about how invested they actually are in making this work. But before we even get to the game itself, there's this entire layer of camp drama that's been simmering underneath every practice rep, every depth chart update, and every single play that's gotten analyzed to death on social media. Here's the reality of where this situation stands right now. The Browns brought in a young quarterback from Colorado who carries massive national attention, comes from an elite family football background, and immediately entered into a competition that nobody expected to be this tight, this late into the summer. The narrative that started before he ever put on a Browns uniform was supposed to be straightforward: a generational talent, a top draft pick's son, the obvious future. Except that's not how preseason competitions actually work. Nothing is obvious when you're talking about NFL-level quarterback play, because the margin between looking elite and looking unprepared is sometimes just a matter of which defense you're going against on a given day, or whether your center remembered to wipe down the football between snaps. The conversation shifted fast. What started as a coronation became a real three-team race. Suddenly, people were measuring reps. Suddenly, people were grading every single throw, analyzing every decision-making moment, and treating camp performances like they were playoff games instead of practice against your own defense. And that's where the emotional temperature started rising, because sports fans are wired to take a side early, commit to a narrative, and then defend it fiercely. Once you pick your guy, every throw from the other options looks worse, and every incompletion from your guy has an explanation. The interception we're going to break down in detail in a second became the focal point of that entire dynamic. One play that got watched more times, analyzed more thoroughly, and debated more intensely than probably any incomplete pass in recent Browns history. And the thing is, that wouldn't be weird at all if this were the playoffs or a regular season game with actual stakes attached. But this is camp. This is practice. This is the time when quarterbacks are supposed to be working through things, making mistakes, and learning from them in a lower-pressure environment before real consequences show up. What changed the conversation wasn't just the interception itself. It was what a former NFL quarterback named Chase Daniel did with that footage. He didn't just watch it once or twice. He broke it down frame by frame, analyzed the mechanics, looked for physical tells, and came up with an explanation that had actual evidence attached to it. That's a completely different level of analysis than just saying it was a bad throw or a bad decision. It's the kind of work that forces you to actually engage with whether something happened the way the surface-level narrative suggests it did. At the same time, local Cleveland media started pushing back on what they saw as an endless cycle of excuse-making. One host in particular got pretty pointed about it, joked about being exhausted trying to guess what the next explanation would be. First it was pressure, then it was a wet ball. What's next? Environmental conditions? The fatigue made sense on one level. There's a real thing that happens in sports media where every mistake by a certain player gets met with immediate context and every great play gets met with immediate skepticism. It's exhausting to watch. But here's where the tension actually gets interesting. That same host admitted he never wanted the Watson trade in the first place and doesn't want Watson to be the starter now. Which means his skepticism about excuses comes from a place of genuine bias, and to his credit, he was honest about that. But it also means we have to ask whether his fatigue with explanations is about the explanations themselves being weak or about the outcome those explanations would suggest if they're actually true. Because those are two different things entirely. The Browns organization, meanwhile, just made a roster move that sends a specific signal about how they're preparing for this moment. They signed a new tight end, a physical specimen named Jermaine Terry II, right as Shedeur is about to take his first real snaps against a legitimate NFL defense. That timing isn't random. Teams don't add new players to the room this close to the season unless they see an immediate role for them or they're making a specific statement about how they're setting up their quarterback for success. So you've got this collision of storylines all happening simultaneously. A young quarterback trying to prove he belongs in this competition. A coaching staff making roster moves that suggest they believe in him or at least want to give him every possible tool to succeed. A piece of film evidence that completely changes how you should think about the most controversial play of the camp. And a media landscape that's simultaneously exhausted by explanations and wrestling with whether that exhaustion is actually justified or just a convenient way to avoid engaging with nuanced reality. All of that funnels directly into one game, one start. One moment where Shedeur gets to prove that camp reps actually mean something or find out that they meant nothing at all. That's what makes this whole situation worth paying attention to, because the answer changes everything about how we evaluate young quarterbacks going forward. Let's start with the roster move, because it's the clearest signal of what the Browns organization is actually thinking right now, even if it doesn't come wrapped in as much drama as the interception story. The Browns brought in Jermaine Terry II, a tight end from Oregon State who's had a bouncy journey through the NFL already. He started as an undrafted free agent with the Giants, didn't stick there, bounced around on injury settlements, and now he's getting another opportunity in Cleveland. On the surface, this looks like a completely routine roster move. Teams cycle through tight ends constantly. It's a position where the turnover is massive because coaches are always looking for that specific combination of size, hands, blocking ability, and scheme fit that doesn't always exist in one package. But the timing of this particular move is what actually matters here. This isn't happening in May. This isn't happening in early August when there are still roster spots available and training camp is just getting started. This is happening right as Shedeur is preparing for his first career start against a real opponent with a real game plan. That specific timing isn't accidental. Front offices don't add new bodies to the room this close to week 1 unless they see an immediate role or they're making a statement. The statement here seems pretty clear. We're giving our quarterback every possible tool to succeed in this debut. A new physical tight end who can win contested situations isn't just roster depth. It's a specific type of security blanket that matters disproportionately for a first-time starter. Here's why that distinction matters. When a young quarterback is making his first start in the NFL, one of the biggest challenges is handling pressure while maintaining decision-making clarity. It's a lot easier to go through progressions cleanly when you've got 5 seconds to step up and find something downfield. It's harder when a defense that's been game planned specifically to attack you is actually executing that plan. That's where a big-bodied tight end who can win in tight coverage becomes invaluable. Suddenly, your young quarterback doesn't have to fit every throw into a perfectly tight window. He's got a built-in answer against pressure. A guy who can go up and make a contested catch even when the read isn't clean. A safety valve that exists specifically for those moments when the coverage is tighter than expected, and you need an immediate option that doesn't require surgical accuracy to complete. Terry's physical profile backs this up. Big-bodied is how he's been described by everyone who's evaluated him. That's code for the kind of target who can create separation through sheer size advantage and can win jump balls against defensive backs trying to play tight coverage. That's exactly what you want in a first-time starter's first game. Coordinators have known for decades that pairing a young quarterback with exactly that kind of physical target simplifies decision-making on passing downs without sacrificing the actual play-calling complexity. Think about how third downs and red zone snaps actually work from a coordinator's perspective. On third and medium, you've got pass defense coverage that's tightened up specifically to prevent big plays. Your receivers are blanketed. Your check-down options are limited. But if you've got a tight end who's 6'4" and can outmuscle a corner in a confined space, suddenly you've got an answer that doesn't require the quarterback to be absolutely perfect with his placement. It's not a crutch. It's just a realistic acknowledgement of what young quarterbacks actually need to succeed early in their careers. The fact that the Browns made this move right now says something important about their confidence level in Shedeur specifically. If the goal was to set him up to struggle, you wouldn't add a new pass catcher to the mix. You'd actually do the opposite. You'd strip away options. You'd make the coverage easier for defenses by limiting who he could throw to. But that's not what happened. They added a weapon. They added a specific type of weapon that addresses one of the biggest challenges a first-time starter faces. The counterargument, of course, is that this is just what competent organizations do regardless of who the quarterback is. You're always looking to improve your roster. You're always trying to find value. A tight end who is available and had physical traits worth evaluating is a reasonable gamble at any point in the calendar. And that's fair. This single move doesn't prove anything on its own. It's contextual evidence, not definitive proof of anything. But context matters. You combine this move with the fact that Shedeur is actually getting his first start, that he hasn't been completely buried on the depth chart, that the coaching staff is still rotating him significant reps, and suddenly you've got a pattern. The pattern is an organization that's genuinely trying to set up one of its quarterbacks to succeed, not sabotage him. That pattern gets important when we talk about what the media narratives around this situation actually mean, because actions tend to speak louder than what gets said in press conferences or what appears on depth charts. Now let's get into the play that's been the epicenter of every quarterback conversation in Cleveland for the last 2 weeks. A single interception that somehow became the most analyzed incomplete pass in recent Browns history. And I say incomplete pass deliberately because that's what it technically was, a throw that didn't connect with its intended receiver and got picked off instead. On first viewing, it looked genuinely bad. The kind of overthrow that had people on Twitter ready to write it off as proof that the skeptics were right all along. Simple bad decision. Simple bad execution. Nothing complicated about it. Except then Chase Daniel, a former NFL quarterback who's done legitimate film breakdown work and knows what he's looking at from an actual technical standpoint, decided to dig into that specific play. And what he did was important enough that it genuinely changes how you should think about what happened on that tape. He didn't just watch it once. He didn't just watch it at normal speed and make a snap judgment. He went back and broke it down frame by frame, roughly 30 times, looking for physical tells that casual viewers would miss on first or second viewing. Here's what he found. Right before Shedeur released that football, the ball visibly flipped and spun in his hand. Not once, twice. And if you know anything about quarterback mechanics at a high level, that's an incredibly specific tell that points to one thing: something is wrong with the grip. The ball isn't sitting where it's supposed to be in his hand. And the most common reason for that at this point in a practice with a center who's been snapping for multiple quarters is moisture. Sweat, specifically. Sweat that's accumulated on the ball through multiple snaps, that's transferred from the center's hands or body, and that's created a slick surface where the quarterback's throwing thumb needs traction. Now I can already hear the pushback. This sounds like an excuse. Wet ball, really? That's the explanation. And I get the skepticism because that was my initial reaction too. But here's where the actual physics of the position comes in, and it's the kind of thing that gets talked about constantly among NFL quarterbacks, but doesn't get nearly enough attention in media coverage. A regulation NFL football has a very specific texture built into the leather, specifically, so quarterbacks can generate consistent spin and grip pressure. The moment any part of that surface gets slick, whether it's from rain, sweat, or general wear late in a practice, the physics of the throw change completely. This isn't theoretical. This is why you see professional teams carry towels on the sidelines. This is why centers wipe the ball down between snaps in bad weather conditions. This is why some of the best deep ball throwers in NFL history have given interviews talking openly about how grip feel is one of the first things that goes when conditions get difficult. It's not an excuse. It's just understanding the mechanics of the position. Chase Daniel's specific point was that Shedeur actually tried to adjust for it in real time. You can see him spinning the ball in his hand mid-drop, trying to find a cleaner grip before releasing it. Daniel called that genuinely impressive quarterback instinct under pressure. The problem is that even with that adjustment, once the moisture hit his thumb at the exact release point, there just wasn't much he could do to save the throw. The spiral was compromised. The accuracy suffered. And what came out of his hand sailed far off target. Now, Daniel's overall read was that a miss this far off target usually doesn't happen from a quarterback throwing a clean, dry football with proper mechanics. Something had to be affecting the grip. And based on everything he saw in the film breakdown, a slick ball from center sweat was his read on what that something was. And here's the important part. This explanation is based on visible evidence on the tape. It's not just speculation. It's not just the kind of excuse-making that sounds good if you want to defend a player. It's an evidence-based analysis from someone who's actually played the position and knows what he's looking at. The counterargument is still valid. A bad throw is a bad throw, some people say, no matter what caused it. But that's not actually how quarterback evaluation works at a high level. Decision-making mistakes look different on film than execution mistakes do. A genuinely bad decision usually involves coverage that was actually tight, a receiver who was clearly covered, a window that closed before the ball arrived. You can trace bad decisions back to the actual read process itself. What Daniel is describing here is different. It's a mechanically clean decision and a mechanically compromised release due to a specific physical variable. That distinction matters a lot when you're trying to project what a quarterback's actual decision-making process looks like instead of just counting turnovers as if they're all created equal. An interception from a bad decision is a real red flag about how a quarterback processes information. An interception from a wet ball is just football. Those are categorically different things, and conflating them is how you end up with flawed evaluation. It's also the kind of nuance that a quick highlight clip or an interception tally in a graphic will never capture on its own. So here's where the local Cleveland media pushback actually comes in, and it's worth taking seriously because the criticism isn't coming from nowhere. One particular host put out a pretty pointed segment where he basically said he's exhausted by the cycle of finding explanations for every single mistake Shedeur makes. First, it was the pressure situation. Then, it was a wet ball. And he sarcastically speculated what wild excuse might come next. Environmental factors. A cosmic alignment. The point was clear. There's a pattern of contextualization happening, and from his perspective, it's becoming tiresome. That frustration is actually legitimate on one level. There's a real phenomenon in sports media where certain players get the benefit of the doubt on every play and other players don't. A veteran quarterback throws an interception, and it's just football, just one of those things that happens. A young or unproven quarterback throws one, and suddenly, it's a referendum on whether he's actually ready for the NFL. That double standard is real, and it happens constantly. The question is whether what we're seeing here is that double standard, or whether it's actually just a case of legitimate concerns being met with increasingly creative explanations. Here's where that same host actually landed, though, and I think this part deserves real attention because it shows he was actually thinking about this more carefully than just dismissing everything. He was upfront about his own bias. He said directly that he never wanted the Watson trade in the first place and doesn't want Watson to be the starter now either, which is a level of honesty about personal preference that you don't always get in sports media. But then he said something important. He said he has to be honest about what he's actually seeing on the field, regardless of those personal preferences. And his honest read, in his own words, is that one quarterback has simply played better than the other two through this stretch. Not because that quarterback had some enormous talent advantage or scheme advantage, since none of these three are working with some historically dominant supporting cast around them, but just based on the actual on-field results. He said he's not interested in manufacturing excuses just to make himself feel better about an outcome he doesn't personally want. And he predicted that Shedeur will eventually get his shot, but probably not in week 1. Now here's where I think it's worth pushing back a little, and not because his analysis is wrong, but because there's a real tension in it that's worth naming. On one hand, he's calling out excuse-making as exhausting and unproductive, basically saying, "I'm tired of hearing explanations, I just want to see what the tape shows." On the other hand, he's making his own broad judgment that one guy has clearly played better off a very small, noisy sample size that includes exactly the kind of play where a credible, evidence-based explanation actually exists and was laid out in detail by someone who's actually played the position. If we're being intellectually consistent about not jumping to conclusions off limited information, that standard has to apply in both directions. It's fair to be skeptical of excuses that don't hold up under scrutiny. It's a completely different thing to dismiss an explanation that actually does hold up, just because you're tired of hearing explanations in general. Because at that point, you're not being rigorous about evaluation. You're just picking the narrative that fits your preference and defending it even when credible counter-evidence shows up. I'm not accusing this particular host of doing that intentionally. To his credit, he was extremely upfront about his own bias, which is more honesty than you get from a lot of media analysis. But the pattern itself is worth naming because once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere in how young quarterbacks specifically get covered. There's a real thing that happens where unproven players get held to what I'd call an interpretation penalty. Every rough play gets read in the least charitable light possible, treated as proof of some deeper fundamental flaw. While the exact same type of play from an established or favored player gets written off as a fluke without a second thought. Both of those framings can't be right at the same time. A wet ball is either a reasonable explanation for a bad throw or it's not. The physics of football don't change depending on who's throwing. Either grip matters or it doesn't. And if we're genuinely committed to understanding quarterback play, the fair approach is to apply the same level of scrutiny and the same openness to context regardless of who the quarterback is or what narrative is more convenient at the moment. That doesn't mean every explanation for every mistake is valid. It means actually engaging with whether the explanation holds up instead of dismissing it because you're tired of hearing explanations. It means asking whether the evidence supports the theory instead of just assuming the worst by default. It means understanding that there's a difference between making excuses and understanding context. One is about protecting a player from fair criticism. The other is about actually understanding what happened on a specific play. Here's something that gets lost in almost every quarterback conversation happening in sports media right now. And it's the kind of fundamental statistical reality that should inform how we think about all of this. When you hear someone say one quarterback has clearly played better than the other two, the thing you should immediately ask is, over what exact window and under what exact conditions? Because that answer completely changes what that claim actually means. Camp practices against your own defense. Joint practices against other teams' backups. One preseason half here, a quarter there. None of that adds up to anywhere close to a real evaluation sample yet. I'm not saying this to make an excuse for anybody or to defend Shedeur specifically. I'm saying it because it's basic statistical reality. If you flipped a coin 10 times and it landed heads 7 times, you wouldn't conclude the coin was rigged toward heads. You'd want a lot more flips before drawing any real conclusion about the underlying probability. Quarterback evaluation isn't a coin flip. Obviously, there's real skill and real signal in what we've seen, but the sample is still small enough that treating any single stretch as a definitive verdict is premature. Think about what we've actually observed. We've seen these quarterbacks throw against defenses that see them every single day and already know their tendencies inside and out. We've seen them in low-pressure situations where the stakes don't really exist yet. We've seen them when they're fresh and rested. We've seen them late in practice when everyone's fatigued. We've seen them with backup offensive linemen in some situations and starting linemen in others. That's not a real evaluation framework. That's just noise. Real quarterback evaluation happens when a defense has spent an entire week studying your tendencies, when there are actual consequences for mistakes, when the coverage is tightened up because the stakes are real. A college basketball team can go undefeated in the regular season and get destroyed in the NCAA tournament because the level of competition is completely different. The same thing happens with quarterbacks. Camp performance and real game performance are not even close to the same thing. This isn't theoretical either. There's actual historical precedent for this. Quarterback prospects who looked incredible in camp and struggled in real games. Quarterbacks who looked pedestrian in the preseason and went on to have Hall of Fame careers. The reason is that those early reps just aren't a big enough sample to tell you much about anything with confidence. The person running the team whose coaching staff has access to all the same film everyone else is watching, but also has way more context and knowledge than any of us do, they understand this. That's why they're not making permanent depth chart decisions off 3 weeks of practice. But here's where it gets interesting when you're watching the commentary. Some people treat camp like it's a referendum on everything. Every throw is definitive. Every interception is proof of a fundamental flaw. Every great play is proof of transcendence. When the reality is that you'd need a huge number of reps in varying conditions against real game plan defenses to actually reach any confident conclusion. The thing is, some of the best quarterbacks in the NFL have had rough camps. Some of the worst backup quarterbacks ever have had great camps. The incentive structure of modern media doesn't reward nuanced takes, though. Quarterback competition is genuinely unclear. We need to see real games to draw real conclusions is not a compelling headline. It's not going to generate engagement or debate in the comment section. One quarterback has clearly played better through this stretch is a much better headline. It's a cleaner narrative. It's something people can grab onto and argue about. Even though statistically, it's built on a foundation that's way too small to confidently support that kind of claim. That's not to say nothing matters. Real skill and real signal exist in what we've seen. Some quarterbacks are just fundamentally better at reading defenses, getting through progressions, making accurate throws. That stuff shows up even in camp, but it shows up alongside noise. A great throw might have been noise. Perfect coverage on one play or the defender being out of position. A bad throw might have been noise too. Weather, grip, a miscommunication with a receiver on their route. When the sample is this small, you can't separate the signal from that noise with any confidence. This is exactly why I think it's worth pointing out specifically. Not to defend Shedeur or attack Watson or make excuses for anybody. Just to be clear about what we actually can and can't conclude from the data we have. We can conclude that there have been moments where each of these quarterbacks has looked good and moments where they've looked less good. We cannot confidently conclude that the quarterback competition is decided because one guy had a better 2-week stretch in August. The thing that matters is what happens when the stakes are real. When a defense has spent a week with a game plan specifically designed to attack you. When there's actual film on you from a real game that opponents can study. When the margin between success and failure has consequences. That's the sample that actually tells you about quarterback readiness. That's what Shedeur is about to get against Buffalo. One full start with real consequences. That single game is going to teach us more about his readiness than another month of camp reps ever could. So here's a critical thing to pay attention to when you're trying to figure out what's actually happening behind the scenes with a quarterback competition. It's not what gets said in media availabilities or what appears on the official depth chart. It's what the organization actually does, because actions have consequences. Narratives are cheap. Coaching staffs know this, which is why you can learn more from what a team actually does with its resources than from what any coach says in a press conference. There's this framing in a lot of the coverage suggesting that maybe the organization is intentionally leaning into a storyline where Watson gets credit for looking better, regardless of what the tape and the actual advanced metrics show. The theory goes something like this. Maybe there's a decision that's already been made behind closed doors, and the front office is managing public perception to make that decision look organic when it's actually predetermined. Maybe the goal is to create enough noise and narrative momentum that when one guy gets named the starter, it doesn't look like a totally obvious choice that was made weeks ago. It's a theoretically plausible explanation for how these situations could play out. Media narratives do get manufactured. Front offices do manage perception. That happens in sports. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's definitely not happening here because I don't have any confirmation of that beyond speculation from media members who, like all of us, are reading tea leaves from the outside. We don't have insider access. We're all guessing based on public information and our own experience with how these situations typically develop. But here's what I will say. If a team was genuinely trying to set a young quarterback up to fail or to build a narrative that justifies his competitor's selection, there are specific actions that would accompany that strategy. You'd see permanently reduced reps as the season approaches. You'd stop giving him opportunities in live game situations. You'd adjust the depth chart to make it absolutely clear that the other guy is the presumed starter. You'd strip away resources. You'd make it obvious through action, not just through media narratives, that this is a one-horse race. That's what narrative management paired with actual quarterback decisions would look like. The problem is that's not what we've actually seen happen. What we've actually seen is a coaching staff adding a new offensive weapon right as Shedeur is preparing for his first career start. Think about what that signals if you think about it carefully. If the goal was to set him up to fail, why would you add a new pass catcher to make his job easier? Why would you give him more options to work with? That makes zero sense strategically. Instead, what you see is an organization that's preparing for a young quarterback to take significant reps in a real game and giving him every possible tool to succeed in that moment. The tight end addition, the continued rotation of reps in camp, the actual selection to start against Buffalo. These are all things that make sense if you're trying to set a quarterback up to succeed or at least give him a real chance to prove himself. They don't make sense if you've already decided he's not your guy and you're just building narrative cover for a predetermined outcome. Actions like that tend to speak louder than depth chart wording or one media segment's framing of a single practice stretch. Because actions have resource consequences. You can't unsign a tight end if you decide later you don't want to give this quarterback a real opportunity. You can't take back the reps you gave him in preseason games or the preparation time your coordinators invested in getting him ready for a specific opponent. Those are real commitments that suggest a real belief that this quarterback is worth investing in, at least to the point of giving him a legitimate shot. Now, does that mean the front office is committed to Shedeur long-term? Not necessarily. Does it mean everything is totally open and there's no preferred outcome? I'm not saying that either. Organizations obviously have preferences. They've made investments in other players. There are competitive dynamics at play. But it does suggest that the organization isn't running some kind of coordinated effort to sabotage one of its own quarterbacks or to manufacture a predetermined outcome through narrative management. What seems to actually be happening is closer to this. The Browns brought in a young quarterback. They want to see if he can compete at this level. They're giving him a realistic opportunity to prove it. That opportunity includes getting one start in a real game with some real weapons around him. Whether he succeeds or fails in that start will tell everyone involved, the coaching staff, the organization, and the public, something real about his readiness. You don't learn that from camp. You learn it from consequence. The tight end signing, the continued reps, the actual first start selection. These are all actions consistent with an organization that's genuinely trying to evaluate a young quarterback under real conditions, instead of one that's just going through the motions, while a predetermined decision is already locked in. And sometimes the simplest explanation actually is the right one. A coaching staff is trying to figure out who their quarterback should be. They're giving multiple guys legitimate opportunities. One of them is about to get a real test against a real opponent with real preparation time from the opposing defense. And we're all going to learn a lot more from that game than we've learned from anything in the last 3 weeks. Let's talk about something bigger that's actually driving a lot of this narrative flattening and oversimplification. It's the incentive structure of the entire sports media ecosystem, and I'm going to be the first to admit that my own channel operates inside that exact same incentive structure. Once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere, and it actually explains a lot about why nuanced quarterback analysis is so rare and why simple stories tend to dominate the conversation. Simple stories travel faster than complicated ones. That's just a fact about how information moves through networks. Watson looked better, is a much easier headline than Watson looked better across a small sample size that includes several plays with specific extenuating circumstances worth examining individually. The first one fits in a headline. The second one requires a paragraph. The first one is easy to remember. The second one requires actual engagement with complexity. And here's the thing, the incentive structure of this entire industry rewards the simple version every single time, because the simple version generates more engagement, more shares, more heated comment sections, more debate, more people clicking. A complicated take that requires caveating and contextualizing doesn't hit the same way in terms of engagement metrics. People scroll past it. People don't feel compelled to argue about it in the comments the same way they do with a definitive claim that feels wrong to them. I'm not accusing individual reporters or hosts of cynically choosing simplicity over accuracy. Most of them are just responding to the incentive structure they're operating in. You make a nuanced argument and it doesn't perform as well. You make a simple argument and it does better. After a while, you internalize that. You start thinking in those terms. You start telling the story the way your audience actually engages with it rather than the way it actually is. It's not conspiracy. It's just how systems work. But it matters because it means the narrative you're hearing about any given situation is probably flatter and more conclusive than the actual reality warrants. A quarterback competition is genuinely uncertain, but the coverage flattens it into one guy clearly being better. A single play has multiple possible explanations, but the coverage just picks the simplest one. A young quarterback's struggles might be about execution problems, or about external factors, or about a combination of both. But the coverage just decides it's about decision-making, because that's the easiest story to tell. This is part of why it's so important to actually dig into specific plays, instead of just accepting the narrative summary of them. Because the narrative summary is almost always going to be simpler than the actual truth. Not because anyone's lying intentionally, but because complexity doesn't travel well. Nuance doesn't go viral. A frame-by-frame breakdown of a wet ball affecting a quarterback's grip is more accurate than just saying he threw a bad interception, but it's also way harder to communicate and way less likely to drive engagement. So what happens is you get this cycle where the simple narrative becomes accepted wisdom through repetition. Enough people say something often enough across enough different channels and shows, and suddenly it feels true even if nobody's really examined whether it actually holds up under scrutiny. That's not unique to football. That's just how media works. But it's worth being aware of because once you notice it, you can actually start asking the right questions about whether what you're hearing is the most accurate account or just the most convenient one. I'm not saying every complicated explanation is true and every simple narrative is wrong. Sometimes the simple explanation actually is correct. Bad throws are usually bad throws, but they're not always all the same category of bad throw, and that distinction actually matters for how you should think about what happened. A decision-making mistake looks different from an execution mistake. A grip issue looks different from a coverage misread. Conflating them all into one category, called interception, loses information that matters. Here's the part where I have to be honest about my own channel's incentive structure too. I'm sitting here making a longer form video about quarterback competition. The engagement on this is going to depend partly on the quality of the analysis, but it's also going to depend partly on how strong and how definitive the takes feel. Nobody wants to watch 20 minutes of someone saying, "I'm not sure, we need more information." People want insights. People want conclusions. People want to feel like they've learned something specific about what this means. So there's pressure to oversimplify, even when oversimplifying is less accurate. There's pressure to pick a narrative lane and defend it. There's pressure to make confident claims, even when the actual evidence doesn't quite support that level of confidence. And some of that is just inherent to the format and the industry. But it's worth being aware of when you're consuming content, because it means the confidence level you're seeing in media narratives is often higher than the actual confidence level of the people making those claims should really be. What I'm trying to do on this channel is separate signal from noise week after week without overreacting to either a great play or a bad one in isolation. Some weeks that means giving credit where it's earned. Other weeks it means pointing out a real flaw that needs fixing. This week it means taking a documented, evidence-based explanation seriously instead of dismissing it, just because it's convenient to stay skeptical. While also keeping in mind that a new tight end just walked into that room to help make Shedeur's job a little easier heading into his first real test as a starting quarterback in this league. All right, so let's zoom all the way out to what this actually means for Shedeur's first career start against Buffalo. This is the moment this entire camp has been building toward. Every single storyline we've covered over the last several weeks, the reps rotation, the depth chart language, the interceptions, the media narratives, the equipment changes, all of it funnels directly into one game, one start. One opportunity to prove whether any of the camp performance actually meant something, or whether it was just noise. Here's what's actually being set up heading into this game. A new physical tight end just got added to the room, which gives this offense another weapon and another safety valve underneath. That's especially valuable for a quarterback making his first career start against a real opponent with real preparation time to scheme against him. A defense that spent a full week studying tendencies from whatever tape exists on Shedeur already. A defensive coordinator whose job is to attack weaknesses and exploit them. That's a completely different situation than camp practice. The interception conversation, once you actually dig into the film breakdown instead of just the box score, looks a lot more like a fluky weather and grip-related miss than a fundamental decision-making problem. Which doesn't mean it didn't happen or that it shouldn't be noted. It just means it's not necessarily proof of what some people have been using it as proof of. And the broader media conversation, even from voices who admit they don't want Watson to be the guy, is still landing on some version of give it time, rather than a definitive verdict that this competition is already over. I think that's actually the most honest place any of us can land on this whole situation right now. We're still incredibly early in real, live football reps for Shedeur specifically. One full start against a real opponent is about to tell us a lot more than another cycle of dissecting a single interception from every possible angle. I'd rather wait for that game, watch how he operates with a genuinely tough tight end target now in the mix, see how he handles Buffalo's pressure looks, and then have a real conversation about where this competition stands instead of continuing to relitigate one wet ball interception that's already been broken down about as thoroughly as any single play can be. Let's think about what a successful debut actually looks like statistically, so we have a real benchmark once Sunday actually happens. I'm not looking for a perfect game. Nobody should be expecting that from a first career start against a real opponent with a real game plan built specifically to attack him. Perfect is not realistic. Perfect doesn't happen in debut starts. What I want to see is exactly what we've tracked all camp: clean decision-making. Checkdowns taken when they're there. Shots taken when the defense actually gives them. Ball security maintained even when the pocket isn't perfect. If Shedeur can put together that kind of profile in his first career start, interceptions and all, that tells us a lot more about his readiness than any camp performance could ever tell us. Because it's coming against a defense that's actually game planned to stop him specifically, not one that sees him every single day and already knows his tendencies. Think about what the film is going to tell us from that standpoint. A clean game where the interceptions and bad decisions are minimal? That's real signal. A disaster where nothing works and decisions look bad? That's real signal too. But it's real signal because it's happening under actual game conditions with actual stakes, not because it happened in one specific practice against your own defense that knows every tendency inside and out. Adding a physical tight end specifically matters so much for a first-time starter beyond just roster depth. A tight end who can win in contested situations gives a young quarterback a built-in answer against pressure and against tight coverage. A big-bodied target he can trust to go up and make a play even when the read isn't perfectly clean. That kind of safety valve tends to matter more in a debut start than almost any other single roster addition, because it takes some of the pressure off having to be surgically precise on every single throw right out of the gate. If Terry ends up seeing real reps against Buffalo, don't be surprised if he becomes one of the first options in structure on third down or in the red zone. Exactly the kind of situations where a first-time starter benefits most from having a big catch radius to throw to. Coordinators love pairing a young quarterback with exactly that kind of security blanket early in his career, because it simplifies the decision-making process on obvious passing downs without asking him to fit the ball into a tighter window than he's ready for yet. Here's the framework I'd use when you're watching the game. Not perfection. Just ask yourself if the decision-making looks sound. Are the progressions getting worked through reasonably? Are the checkdowns being taken when they need to be taken? Is he protecting the football when the situation demands it? Can he handle pressure without completely losing his mind and just chucking it into coverage? Because those are the things that actually matter for a first-time starter. Everything else is context. The final stat line, the number of completions or interceptions, all of that matters, but it matters less than the actual process. Because the process tells you whether this quarterback is capable of learning, capable of handling pressure, capable of making decisions based on what the defense is showing him. One game isn't a final verdict on anything, but it is genuinely meaningful information that trumps 3 weeks of camp reps every single time. That's the whole approach on this channel. Treat every play, every stat, and every roster move with the same level of scrutiny, whether the conclusion ends up flattering or not. This week, that means acknowledging that evidence-based explanations exist for some of these camp plays, while also recognizing that none of it actually matters compared to what's about to happen against Buffalo. So where does all of this actually leave us heading into the most important moment of this entire quarterback competition? With a situation that's genuinely uncertain. A young quarterback getting his first real opportunity against a real opponent with new weapons to work with. A defense that's prepared specifically to attack his weaknesses. And a media landscape that's oversimplifying the actual complexity of what's happening. One more thing before we wrap up. Debut starts for young quarterbacks around this league have gone every possible way in recent memory. From immediate signature performances to rough, humbling afternoons that still ended up being valuable building blocks for the rest of the season. There's no single script that determines what Sunday looks like. And I'd rather walk into that game with realistic expectations than either wild hype or doom and gloom based on one interception and one film breakdown. If you're new here, this is Dree Reports. I'm Dree Fiber, and we're covering every single Browns roster move, every practice update, and every game breakdown all season long, so you never miss a beat with your quarterbacks, your rookies, and everything else happening in Cleveland. Subscribe right now so you don't miss the full breakdown of Shedeur's first career start against the Bills, because that game is about to give us more real answers than anything we've covered up to this point. Drop your honest take in the comments about what you're actually expecting to see, and I'll catch you in the next one.